Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, coming to you from the studios of KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM and live streaming at ksqd.org. I'm the producer and your host today, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Today, we're taking on a sensitive and controversial topic, reproductive freedom. In order to explore how this relates to mental health, we reached out to our community and asked for stories from women and people who can become pregnant about their experiences of making reproductive decisions. We received a collection of tender, nuanced, and highly personal stories that you'll be hearing today. The way each of the people who tell their stories today makes meaning of their experience varies greatly, and sometimes how they shape their meaning appears to be in direct conflict with another's. But what is common to all the stories is that carrying a pregnancy to term and giving birth is not a minor incident that a person can go through and hardly be impacted. It's a major event in one's life, physically, hormonally, financially, and often emotionally. Some of what you'll hear today may be difficult, may challenge some of your beliefs or values, and still, we urge you to stay with us. Listen through your discomfort and challenge yourself to hold the complexity, the diversity, and the common humanity in each of these stories. Since the Supreme Court overturned the reproductive rights protected by Roe v. Wade, the news has been filled with talk about new laws restricting access to reproductive health services. What we can forget in all the talk is that in the end, this is not just about state legislators, federal laws, or religious beliefs. This is about people and their very personal stories, and the many complex forces at play that can lead to a pregnancy. Forces that can include abuse, exploitation, medical crisis, failed birth control, poor parenting, low self-worth, bad relationships, derailment of an academic or career path, and threats to mental health. What is clear as we listen to each of these stories is how very essential it is to have reproductive self-determination, the ability to make decisions about your own body and set the course for your own life in order to take care of and achieve good mental health. We also want to advise listeners that today's episode will reference sexual behavior and people will be discussing abortion. With me today to listen, reflect on, and respond to these important reproductive health stories is Alyssa Perucci, the Counseling and Administrative Manager at the Women's Options Center at San Francisco General Hospital. She's worked in abortion counseling for nearly 2 decades and is the author of Decision Assessment and Counseling in Abortion Care, Philosophy and Practice. She's provided workshops on counseling skills across the United States and Canada and in Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. She's dedicated her career to empowering and supporting those working in abortion care to provide a humanistic, patient-centered, and trauma-informed approach to pregnancy decision counseling. Welcome, Alyssa, to State of Mind. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Deborah. It's so great to be with you today.
So let's get started. And Alyssa, I want to ask you, why did you say such a resounding yes when I asked you to come make this episode with me about the role reproductive self-determination plays in mental health and wellness?
Well, I think the first reason is what you mentioned in the beginning. We have had an issue in our country this summer, June 24th of this year, which is really changing everything around access to abortion. And that has really put what you have brought to the table here on the front burner. We have seen the consequences of this decision already. We will see how it continues to have what I believe is a disastrous effect on the mental health and wellness in this country, not only for women and pregnant people, but also for their partners, their families, and their children. Reproductive self-determination, our topic for today, is also an issue of health justice and health equity, because low-income people Black identified people, Indigenous people, and people of color will bear the greatest burden of these restrictive and oppressive laws that curtail reproductive freedom in all of its forms. So that was really it could not be ignored. Like your timing is really perfect. The second reason, which is a reason that is always with us, a reason why this particular topic is always important, and that's because abortion is common and abortion is normal. Yet it is also complex and nuanced, as you mentioned. Abortion is a normal part of the reproductive lifespan, along with miscarriage and childbirth. Many of our listeners already know how 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in her lifetime, and how 60% of women having abortions have already given birth. But at the same time, even with all of this normalcy and how common it is, abortion is stigmatized. And I think it's that dissonance between those two things that calls us to talk about experiences with abortion, both to better understand the complexity and the nuance, so we can better support ourselves and care for ourselves, but also care for one another. It reminds me that abortion, because abortion is controversial, it has been thoroughly researched. No stone has been left unturned. And there are quite a few things that we can say with certainty about abortion. One, that it's common and normal. The other one is that it is safe. I like to say that the jury is in on both of those topics. Um, we also know quite a bit about why women and pregnant people have abortions. And I think some of what I'm about to say will come up in some of the stories that we're gonna hear today. Um, Reasons for abortion are because people need to focus on the children they already have, or they have other dependents they're caring for. They need to start school, stay in school, get a job, keep a job in order to pursue a better life, but also sometimes just to survive. Their family may be complete, or they may have never wanted children. They may be having problems in their relationship, which can include intimate partner violence, or they may have realized that single parenting is neither realistic nor acceptable. And finally, they may have concerns about their own health or concerns about the health of the pregnancy. But what is really troubling about all of this is that the reasons that the public supports access to abortion, and the public being all of us, right, and all the people that support us, the reasons that the public supports abortion are for reasons of rape, incest, and a fetal diagnosis. And those represent a small minority of all abortions. But the reasons that women and pregnant people actually have abortions are for reasons of survival. Yet the politicians and the public judgmentally label these abortions as abortions for convenience, and thus the stigma, and thus the impact on our mental health, how we care for ourselves, and how we support one another. And I think that the stories that we're going to listen to are going to bring up all of these reasons, and we're going to see how some of those intersect with the support that they've been given or have not been given, the stigma that they feel, um, and how they cope going forward.
Well, that's a perfect lead in to take us to begin listening to the stories we've received. The first story we'll hear is from Linda, who had an unwanted pregnancy before abortion was legal in the United States. In having to pursue an abortion illegally, she was made vulnerable to exploitation, abuse, medical crisis, and unnecessary trauma.
I'm now in my late 70s, but as a 20-something-year-old in the mid-1960s, I had an illegal abortion. My college boyfriend and I had broken up, and I'd left California for a job in a Midwestern state. Discovering I was pregnant was a nightmare. I didn't know a soul in the small town where I'd moved, didn't have a doctor, didn't have any money, couldn't take care of a baby, and wouldn't keep my job if anyone found out. There was no question in my mind that I needed an abortion. There was no agonizing about the decision. The only issues were how, when, and where would I get the money. An old friend promised to make the arrangements with a Navy doctor in San Diego, so with every penny from my savings account, I bought a plane ticket and got $600 in cash to pay for the abortion. The Navy doctor in San Diego never materialized, or maybe he had just been fabricated by the old friend who found it convenient to have sex with me the night I arrived, which I felt I owed him. He said, "After all, you're already pregnant." Instead, I stood on the corner of a street in Tijuana with a bag of groceries, waiting to be picked up by two men in a truck who took me to a dark room where I laid down on a raised bed and shut my eyes, my ears, and my brain to what took place. All I remember is that at some point, the hot table lamp fell on my arm, leaving a burn near my elbow. 2 days later, I was found bleeding on the floor of the room I had rented and was taken to the hospital. The pain was excruciating, but the ER doctors and nurses were not sympathetic, and I felt completely alone. Slightly more than 10 years later, in my mid-30s, I got pregnant again. My situation had changed, and I was in a long-term stable relationship. He was an older, divorced man with 4 adult children, and we'd been living together for several years. Becoming pregnant could have been the impetus for us to marry, and while it was not planned, I felt good about it. Then my doctor informed me that it was an ectopic pregnancy that would have to be terminated, and so it was, quickly and antiseptically in the local hospital, a simple outpatient procedure. There was no pain, no physical evidence of the clinical process, and I was able to go to work the next day. But all of the emotion, so completely absent the first time, swirled ceaselessly within me. This decision had not been a no-brainer like the first one. Although I knew it was legal and was told it was medically necessary, it was emotionally agonizing. I made the decision to have an abortion each time, but the results were completely different in terms of my physical and emotional responses. It seems impossible to me that a basic right, one I marched and fought for when I was young, has been ripped away after 50 years.
Next, we're going to hear from Magali, who makes what are a small set of decisions that would be typical of any teen with limited resources, and as a result, finds her entire future at risk.
When I was a teenager, I made up my mind about the abortion issue. Why would anyone need an abortion if they could use birth control? We were in the late 20th century. Everyone who wanted to prevent pregnancy could do it with foolproof ease. Never mind that I was growing up in Mexico, a predominantly Catholic country where teen pregnancies soared after Pope John Paul II visited and said that contraception was against God. My own childhood was unconstrained by religion. In accordance with my parents' liberal views, I had my first sex ed class in 4th grade. The educator gathered us into a circle and passed around pills, condoms, diaphragms, vials of spermicide, and IUDs, and made sure that each of us touched each contraption with our very own hands. I felt fully equipped to prevent unwanted pregnancies and was certain I'd never have to sit in the crosshairs of the abortion question. 10 years later, excellent grades and bilingual education landed me a scholarship to study in a prestigious British boarding school. During winter break, I couldn't afford to fly home to Mexico for the holidays. My plan was to survive with as little money as possible by couch surfing. I went to Oxford to visit an acquaintance. I will call her Agnes, the privileged child of the London suburbs who felt sophisticated because she could get drunk and be sexually promiscuous. Agnes knew nothing about my barely extant sex life, or how Catholic prudishness had entered me by osmosis. It was the coldest night of my life, yet she decided we needed to go out on the town. I stepped into the dark fog in my thin boots and inadequate jacket. We met 2 male friends of Agnes in a pub and had a whiskey to warm up. Then we had another. Then we went back to her place where she served wine. I was unable to take but a few sips. I had never been drunk before. I started nodding off, and then I threw up and blacked out. The following morning I woke up, naked under a sleeping bag in the living room, feeling pain between my legs. Ashamed for having gotten drunk, I resolved to forget what had happened. The word rape was not in my vocabulary. 2 weeks later, while couch surfing in Scotland, I woke up one morning and vomited. My head was swimming. I was dizzy, heavy, tired. My breasts were sore and I felt bloated. I didn't need a pregnancy test to confirm what I knew to be true. How could I let this happen to me? I took all the blame and never acknowledged that Agnes had fed me to the wolf. 1 month after turning 18, I was pregnant, alone, and poor in a foreign country, far from my family, whose judgment I was certain I could not survive. The worker at a women's clinic confirmed that I was pregnant and explained my options: keep it, abort it, or give it up for adoption. I was 6 months away from finishing school. Having a baby felt unthinkable. I was convinced my parents would disown me and that I'd end up doing menial jobs, raising my baby alone in a hovel in Mexico City. The prospect of carrying a child for 9 months and giving it away felt like ripping my own heart out. And I knew it would devastate me to look into the face of a child of mine and say, "You were born of violence." That was my whole country, born of colonization. At the clinic, I learned that abortion was legal in Britain and covered by the National Health Service. I wouldn't need to pay for it, and since I had just turned 18, I did not need parental consent. I had to eat my words. I promised myself I'd never judge again, and although I grieved, I never regretted my decision.
Alyssa, I want to ask you, after you listen to these tender stories, what do you see are the important elements related to mental health in both Linda and Magali's stories?
I'll start with Linda. What I love and something that Linda said, it's something about the way that she said it. She said, I made the decision to have an abortion each time, but the results were completely different in terms of my emotional and physical responses. And I think I want to start with that because that really struck me. And it reminds me about how that certainty about one's decision, certainty with one's head or thinking self, can be present alongside a type of what I might call an emotional conflict with the decision or a sadness. And what I think is interesting is that if we're really listening to Linda, if like we were Linda's friend or her partner or someone close to her and listening, we might also be tempted to miss that emotion because we get caught up in her certainty. And I'm happy for her that she has that ownership, right? I'm happy for her each time that she knew the way that she needed to go. But it's so interesting how she said this decision, meaning the abortion decision with the ectopic pregnancy, this decision had not been a no-brainer like the first one. And I think also sometimes when we're supporting people, we might view some pregnancy decisions as ones that, well, why would you have conflict about that? It's an ectopic pregnancy. It's medically necessary. And she's right. I mean, it's kind of an emergency, and she needed to help herself survive by having that procedure. And we'll hear some more examples of that going forward in some of the other stories. But if we're really listening to Linda, we hear in what she's saying, there's a bit of a loss about a path not taken, a path that she couldn't take because of it being an ectopic pregnancy. And she didn't say this in so many words, but I'm listening in between the lines of what she's saying and wondering if that was like a moment where she saw the possibility of her life going in a certain way, and then it wasn't able to go that way. And, I would say that that's very normal. We all have when you live a life on this earth, you have path after path after path that was not taken. And we grieve those losses. With Magali, the line that I loved so much from her is at the end when she said, I had to eat my words. I promised myself I'd never judge again. And although I grieved, I never regretted my decision. And I think that's similar to me in the sense of someone might say, how could Magali have grief when she experienced violence, when she experienced a pregnancy as a result of rape, although she did, as she said, she did not have that word at that time. And if we're really truly being present to her and helping her through that as her friend, as her support, we allow her to have that complex feeling, even in the context of that pregnancy, and how she, as a part of her wisdom, was able to self-reflect and change her beliefs. She grew in her compassion for self and her compassion for others. That is a part of wisdom. And I could see her. She also, she didn't say this, but when I imagined her going forward in her life and being able to help other people who were in that situation out of the expansiveness that grew in her heart from that flexibility and that change in who she was as a person.
This is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today I'm joined by Alyssa Perucci, Counseling and Administrative Manager at the Women's Options Center at San Francisco General Hospital. We're also hearing from community members who've sent us their stories about making reproductive choices, sometimes pursuing an abortion and sometimes not. And we're discussing the important role of autonomy and choice for maintaining and achieving good mental health. We're coming to you from the studios of listener-supported KSQD in Santa Cruz, California. Stay with us, and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. Well, the next story we're going to hear is from Julie, and it doesn't involve overt abuse or exploitation, and yet her reasons for ending a pregnancy in order to preserve her own life and future are equally valid.
Choice? I always had a choice. There was no waffling, no flip-flops, yes, angst. I did not want a baby. I would abort. It was 1989. I was over 30, just barely. Perhaps growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area shaped my values. Of course it did. I recall when I deduced that my maternal grandmother, who had married in November 1930 and had given birth to my mother in June 1931, had gotten pregnant before walking down the aisle. I was 18. I'd never given those dates any attention before. And of course, my first 30 years were very different than my grandmother's or my mother's. What has always been comfortable was a decision to abort that fetus. It was my decision. I never wanted his child. He was a liar. We were in lust, not love. He was married, a Catholic, a father of 3 girls, and though he claimed to be separated from his wife and planning to divorce, his confessions kept him repeating his lies. A baby of his destroying my future? I was a businesswoman, still am, with a great start in gear. Destroyed by a married man's child? Not I, not me. What stuck in my mind was informing this man he would come with me to the OB/GYN appointment to abort the fetus, and he had to pay for it. He did. He sat in that waiting room confronting his sin, likely plural, sins, and if he thought it my sin, this decision, well, good. He can keep that sin in his box of guilt. I went into the procedure room with the nurse and never looked back. I had no side effects, no regrets ever. One day, the operations manager at my office handed me an envelope. I don't recall if it had been received via U.S. mail or hand-delivered. There was no return address. I opened the envelope, which, because of regulations in the industry in which I work, had already been opened by the ops manager. Inside was $250. No note. I knew who it was from. I still shudder with this memory because I was afraid management would question why I was receiving cash. They never asked. Class act, those men, unlike the one who shot his wad, creating a zygote and slinked away. Had I not made the choice to terminate that pregnancy, and it was my choice, never to open the discussion, not an option, the father never protested the abortion, had I not chosen to abort, I don't think I would have survived. I would have been forced to leave my career. Single mothers were not supported in any way in that industry. My parents implied, had even said aloud too, don't bring a baby home for us to take care of. I would have been alone with a child I did not want. How cruel to that child and to the free child in me. When Roe v. Wade was about to be pulled from the body of our nation's laws, my daughter of 28, single, a trailblazer creative, asked, "Mom, did you ever have an abortion?" "Yes," I answered. And as the young do, she shared with friends, "My mother had an abortion so she could have me."
I love it. Julie. Yeah, it's just really powerful. Julie knew what she needed to do in order to survive. And that's where that word abortion, to be able to survive, really rings true throughout all of these stories. I feel that Julie really punctuates it. And I found myself asking, why can we not just trust Julie? And how she said, and Linda also mentioned, that I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe we're going backwards in time and we're about to lose this right. And it's because there are people that don't trust Julie to know what she needs to do at that moment in her life in order to be able to be the person, the full personhood of a human being that she wants to be. I love how she said, how cruel to that child and to the free child in me. And why does she not have that right to be a full person now? Luckily for her and her time, she had that. But that's what she's contemplating. Like, how is this possible? That's what Linda contemplates. How is this possible that they can be taking this away, this ability of self-determination and my freedom?
Well, the next story we'll hear is from Brittany, who tells several stories within her story. And in doing so, she touches on the many issues that inextricably tie mental health, just as much as physical health, with the need for comprehensive reproductive health care that includes the option to end a pregnancy.
I grew up in a religious house in which there wasn't much openness about the body. So for me, sex was always a mystery. At 18, I became pregnant. Though I was engaged to my partner, it was still against the beliefs of my upbringing to have sex before marriage. Shortly after I found out I was pregnant, I also found out that my fiancé was not who I thought he was. He was not just a bad person, but a very dangerous one. And I knew I wouldn't stay with him, not only for myself, but for the sake of my baby. I had a choice to make, either to be a single parent or to give my child up for adoption. I didn't know that abortion was an option And to be honest, I didn't really even know what abortion was. In order for me to protect my daughter in the best way I could, I chose to relinquish her. My hope was that I could spare her the heartache, danger, and physical pain that her father was causing me. He tried to kill me multiple times. And I chose life for my daughter, and if I could do it, life for myself. Fast forward 11 years, I was married to a good man and wanting to have children. When we got pregnant, I was so excited, but something felt different. I was experiencing pain like I had never had in my first pregnancy. My OB continually brushed off my concerns until I was in the ER doubled over in pain, where I was told I had an ectopic pregnancy, and it was a matter of life and death. I chose to have a methotrexate shot to abort my fetus, and I was told that I would have mild cramping and bleeding like a period. By the next day, I was doubled over in pain, bleeding so badly that my husband rushed me to the ER where I was stabilized, but I would spend over a week on the couch in pain. At the time, I couldn't figure out why I was so depressed. I had chosen abortion to save my life, grateful to have had that option. 6 years after my ectopic, with 2 living children and 9 miscarriages, I was only 15 months postpartum from my last baby and just coming out of the fog of the most difficult postpartum depression, anxiety, and rage. I was finally beginning to feel like I had my life back when I found out I was pregnant. I was not prepared to mentally and physically go through another pregnancy again. When I expressed my grief and shame to my OB at being pregnant again, she listened, and she told me I had options. During the ultrasound, it was clear that there was something wrong, and it was deemed that my baby was incompatible with life. If I'm honest, I was relieved. Though a part of me wanted to have one more baby, deep down, I didn't think I could survive another pregnancy and postpartum depression. We chose to terminate. Once again, I chose life for myself, and I chose to release my baby from the pain it would have felt in its short life. It was not easy. I struggled with depression and anxiety, with complicated grief, and I felt ashamed of my decision. No one except my OB, my husband, and I know the truth. Everyone else in my life thinks we lost the baby to a miscarriage. We allow them to think that because it's easier than having to explain our choice. In my work as a full spectrum doula, I support people going through infertility, loss, birth, abortion, and death. The most important thing to me is that everyone should have a choice to do what is right for ourselves.
There's so much there with Brittany. Um, I I guess I just want to make a shout out to how she really uses that turn of phrase. I appreciate. I chose life for myself, and how she uses that phrase. I chose life, and I like how she used it in the beginning too. I chose life for my daughter, and if I could do it, life for myself, because she was facing intimate partner violence, and was concerned for her life. One of the other things I want to highlight with Brittany is really the struggle with what we call negative support, starting with her fiance, who was physically abusive. Also, negative support when she had her fetal diagnosis, when her baby would not survive. And some of us may assume, make assumptions about, oh, everyone will understand if you're having an abortion. for a fetal diagnosis. And she had to decide to use privacy and secrecy to protect her mental health. And what I want to do is just to say to people that that's okay, that you need to prioritize yourself and your family, and you get to decide who you tell. And that sometimes privacy and secrecy are the only ways that we can keep ourselves safe.
And yet that speaks to, as we often address in so many of our shows, the role that stigma plays in terms of further impacting when people are facing difficult mental health challenges. Stigma amplifies and it exacerbates those issues. And this really is a great example of that.
Good point.
Well, the next story we're going to hear is from Jen, a doctor who was committed to providing full spectrum reproductive health care, which included providing abortions. When Jen became pregnant, they surprisingly bumped up against the nuanced complexity of this work until they found a new way to hold and understand it for themselves.
I began providing abortion care during my family practice residency over 30 years ago. I was proud to be an abortion provider and give care that was grounded in compassion and respect. It always felt right. I never questioned my choice. Early during my first pregnancy, I began experiencing a dis-ease when providing abortions. The feelings were hard to name and hard to acknowledge. Abortion care was such an important part of my identity as a physician, rooted in social justice. I could barely imagine stopping. It didn't make sense to me that my pregnancy and the growing child inside me was a reason to stop doing abortions. I felt compelled to honor these feelings even though I didn't understand them. So I stopped. About 3 years later, when my second child was a year old, I realized I wanted to try providing abortion care again. I searched for the feelings that had compelled me to stop while I was pregnant, but they seemed to have vanished. When a woman in her mid-40s came to the abortion clinic with her partner, I asked the usual questions. "Are you feeling okay about this decision?" She started to cry. "No, I feel terrible. I have 3 children and I love them more than life itself. I can't believe I'm choosing to end a life. It feels wrong. But I cannot bring another child into the world. I just can't be pregnant now. It would break me." Until that moment, I had never thought about spirit in relation to providing abortion. I don't know where my words came from. Perhaps we can't end spirit. Perhaps you can connect and say goodbye, wish this spirit well and invite it to come back another time. Perhaps not with you, but with a person or a family that's ready and wanting a child. We all cried. After a while, she took a breath. "Thank you. We can go ahead." I needed to acknowledge the truth. By providing abortions, I was ending a life. And at the same time, there was something called spirit, and I could not end spirit. I began to offer this reflection with patients. After a procedure, I invited people to hold a glass dish and see the products of conception if they wanted, to speak or be in silence, to grieve if there was grief, to have closure. Many expressed gratitude for this experience. I began taking moments on my own to acknowledge each procedure and the life I had taken, deepening my connection to what I had found on my journey, awareness of both the loss and of hope. For understandable reasons, pro-choice advocates have avoided acknowledging loss and the ending of a life. It is rarely acceptable to talk about spirit, and yet it seems that many of us yearn for this acknowledgement. It can bring healing. It did for me.
I really appreciate how Jen has the courage to take the space to make their own assessment of what providing abortions means to them. And that can be stigmatized within the abortion community. I work with a lot of physicians who are doing their specialty training in abortion. And inevitably, we come around with a lot of them to the conversation of how they get to set the boundaries around what they feel comfortable doing, what feels right to them, and when it feels right. I like to say to people, there isn't like this litmus test of how pro-choice you are, right? And if you don't do this, that, or the other, um, you're not really giving to the movement. That is so not true. Everyone gets to decide when, where, how, what is speaking to them, and making them feel comfortable. Um, and and that's part of really supporting one another.
This is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, and I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today I'm joined by Alyssa Perucci, Counseling and Administrative Manager at the Women's Options Center at San Francisco General Hospital. We're also hearing from community members who've sent us their stories about making reproductive choices, sometimes pursuing an abortion and sometimes not. And we're discussing the important role of autonomy and choice for maintaining and achieving good mental health. Every State of Mind show has a resource list, and the resources we talk about today and many more can be found on the post for this episode at ksqd.org/state of mind. We're coming to you from the studios of KSQD Community Radio for the Monterey Bay. This broadcast also live streams on the web at ksqd.org. Podcasts for all State of Mind episodes can be found on all the major podcast services, on the KSQD website, and on your home smart speaker. Stay with us and we'll be right back after this brief message from our underwriter.
KSQD thanks Planned Parenthood Marmonte for supporting State of Mind. Planned Parenthood Marmonte provides education and comprehensive health services, including birth control, abortion, and testing for pregnancy, HIV, and sexually transmitted diseases. More information at ppmarmonte.org. Thank you, Planned Parenthood Marmonte, for supporting community radio K-Squid 90.7 FM.
Back to our interview. Well, Alyssa, from all the stories you've heard today, and from all the work that you do with people who become pregnant, what do you want to leave listeners with as your main message today?
I have a thought about listening. I think one of the most important gifts we can give to another person is the gift of listening. And that's when you really hear stuff about the nuances, the complexities, what's being juxtaposed. And I think when we're listening to other people, we tend to make three mistakes. We either start giving advice, we steer the conversation back to ourselves about something similar that's happened to us, or we're not really listening because we're thinking really hard about what something great is that we can say to the other person. I suppose I just want to suggest that listening really means you don't have to say anything. It's about being silent, letting the other person have center stage, and sometimes asking open-ended questions like, how so? Or what was that like for you? How was that for you? There's no need to fix. Even the most complex questions, even the most deepest of conflicts or the most intense of words, we're not here to fix. It's the listening that is part of healing in mental health and wellness. The other thing I want to leave us with are some hints about what are some factors that are associated with good coping after making a pregnancy decision. This is both for ourselves and for other people that we're supporting. And those three things are really honing the story that you tell about that pregnancy decision and infusing it with compassion and empathy for yourself, given the circumstances in which you are making that decision. So really grounding it and acknowledging the reality of the here and now in which you need to make that particular decision. If your life were otherwise, you might make a different decision, but you're making it in the context of the life that you have now. The second thing is about support, and we've mentioned a few things in the stories about support. We want the presence of positive support, meaning loving, compassionate, non-judgmental people. And we really ideally want the absence of negative support, but not everyone can remove negative support. Sometimes negative support, which is name calling, bullying, manipulation, is present in the people that are closest to us that we can't necessarily get away from. And so what we want to do in those circumstances is really shore up positive support, surrounding yourself with people who are giving you positive support, but also if you need to go outside of friends and family, on my resource list, I list 6 different places that we can go for free to get some positive support around pregnancy decisions. And I'll mention a couple of those. One is All Options, which is an organization with a talk line that provides compassionate, non-judgmental support before and after all pregnancy decisions. And another one on there is We Testify, which is about storytelling, which is what happened tonight. And they seek to increase the spectrum of abortion storytellers in the public sphere and elevating people of color. I also want to echo something that Deborah said in the beginning, which is really our goal for ourselves is that we can hold these issues and all of the complexity and all of the nuance, and listen compassionately and with a little less judgment. And that's really kind of a great life goal for all of us every day.
Well, we have one last capstone story to share with you, one that we received from writer, teacher, and poet Patrice Vecchione, whose story touches on many of the complex forces impacting women then and now that can lead them to find themselves pregnant. Her story also brings to light many of the intersecting factors at play as a young person tries to build a life and exercise autonomy over their body and thus their future.
Part 1. Late one night, I left my house and knocked on a neighbor's door. A blonde-haired man I really didn't know, nor one I wished to know, lived there. As though he'd been expecting me, he sleepily let me in, and we took off our clothes. While he roughly pushed and pumped away, I thought about other things, something I often did in those days when having sex. In the 1970s, during the, quote, sexual revolution, when I came of age, there was a new expectation put onto young women. In addition to being pretty, coy, yet simultaneously tantalizing and not outspoken, we were now also assumed to be sexually available, to want something that maybe we did, but maybe we did not want. No matter the point in history or the cultural norms, any young woman who held herself in good esteem would never have chosen to go to the home of a stranger to have sex when she was really looking for other things, like being seen, valued, and loved. One of the results of coming out of a childhood in which I was regularly demeaned is that it took me a long time to learn how to consistently treat myself well, and that gives my story its particular sadness. By going to that man's house, I demeaned myself, and not for the first time. The moment after he ejaculated, a jolt of anxiety ran through my mind and body. I knew I was pregnant. With a kind of clarity that could be applied to only a very few things in my life in 1977, I knew exactly what I'd have to do. But first, I got out of there and never spoke to him again. That night, I shocked myself into realizing that I was the only one who could save me. If I truly wanted the life I'd just begun to envision, that of being a writer and a teacher, becoming a 20-year-old single mother with few employable skills beyond having anonymous sex and cleaning squid in a fast food fish place was not an option. As my father used to say, "You're not born learned." And that night, his words took on a significance they'd not had before. His other words that were among my childhood's sound bites were, "What are you, an idiot?" Despite the little faith he seemed to have in me, at that moment I knew I was not an idiot. And so I knew exactly what a young woman with not only a self-esteem but a drug problem would do. Though troubled, I quickly discovered just how determined I was to make something of my life. I would not whittle it away as I perceived my mother had hers. I refused to live a life not of my choosing. I would not follow a prescribed path that had neither been forged for me nor by me. Part 2. Abortion had been made legal only a few years before I got pregnant. I knew this, my friends knew this, and we knew what that Supreme Court ruling could mean for us. Just as young women know now, and are experiencing, what the court's overturning of Roe v. Wade means to them. Home pregnancy tests had recently come onto the market. After peeing into the device, I waited the few hours for the results to appear, verifying what I already knew. A few years before, when I was 15, my feminist mother had said, "Tell me when you become sexually active, and I'll take you to the doctor and get you on the pill." "Now," I'd replied. After a while, the pill began to make me ill, so I'd gotten a diaphragm, one that I nearly always used. My mother wasn't one of the two women I told I was pregnant. Only my best friend and my roommate knew. Had I told my mother, she would have done all the right things, found a doctor, scheduled the appointment, driven me there, and even paid for the procedure. But the price of her assistance would have been the unbearable weight of shouldering her disappointment in me. She would have tisked, sighed, glanced, and huffed me into shame. Instead, the kind and understanding women at the Santa Cruz Women's Health Collective connected me with a local doctor who performed my abortion. If I remember correctly, I paid for it over time. Afterward, I got into bed with a hot water bottle and spent the rest of the day there. I recall feeling crampy and tired the next day also. But mostly what I felt was relieved and liberated from a life I did not want. Not then nor ever did I want to have children. Young and uncertain as I was, I knew it would have been impossible for me to give up the baby had I carried my pregnancy to term. Choosing abortion was a first step in advocating for myself. By making this decision, I'd done right by myself and my future. Was I smothered by guilt? No, I was not. I had terminated a pregnancy. I had not killed a baby, 2 points that are regularly conflated by those who wish to control and marginalize women. Part 3. Whatever her circumstances, every woman who chooses abortion has her own reasons personal and private. Had abortion still been illegal in the U.S., I'm certain I'd have risked my life to terminate that pregnancy. My future was not going to be determined by a fertilized egg in my uterus. After all, that embryo was inside my body. Even for young women coming out of secure childhoods, those who know their value, growing up and finding one's way is difficult. It takes a long time. One way we learn is through making mistakes. And isn't that just part of being young? Should I have been held accountable for the rest of my life for this misstep? Of all the mistakes I've made throughout my life, frankly, getting pregnant is hardly the worst of them. Abortion is a rather simple medical procedure, and having an unwanted pregnancy need not be a catastrophe. Though often beset by fear and overcome by doubt as I found my way in life, I was also a young woman brimming with curiosity, joy, determination, and creativity. I flung myself into and against life, wanting to find my way through nearly everything I could and on my own terms. Day by day, and over many years, I became the writer and teacher I wanted to be. If, as a society, we truly wished women and men to be treated equally, women would have equal rights, equal freedom to make decisions about their own bodies. Period. That simple. It took me a few decades after my abortion before I chose to write about the experience. And in doing so, I felt the experience freshly again and applauded my decision, but from a long distance this time. I love the vigor, the honesty and certainty that came through my language. Writing is a way to own our truths, to hone them, and to heal from what's been difficult. If you've had an abortion recently or a long time ago and wish to, pick up a pen and grab a notebook. Look back. Trust the words that come to you. Write for yourself, not for anybody else. Virginia Woolf said, "We think back through our mothers if we are women." I not only thought back through my mother, I thought forward. I wanted to invent a life, and thanks in part to my abortion, I have. Pregnant. Held by the clutch and pin of his rough hands, this was no act of love. Leaving my body behind, I drifted to a far corner of the room. Before morning, I knew there was a fish in my belly. Your gesture was the flutter of a fin. Little swimmer, I said, find yourself another ocean. What was I to do? My future was the breathing in of snow, my history a book I slapped shut each night. And though I practiced your name behind closed doors, I refused you. I shut the door. Of all the actions I have doubted, I never doubted this.
If you found today's show interesting and you'd like to learn more, think more deeply about these issues, or are looking for resources for yourself or a loved one, check out the resource list that will be posted with this episode at ksqd.org/stateofmind. I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Alyssa Perucci, and to Patrice Vecchione, who not only recorded and shared her own story, she helped support some of the other people you've heard today tell and record theirs. We also want to say a heartfelt thanks to each of the people who boldly told, recorded, and sent us their stories. And thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. Special thanks to Jeannie Boldzikowski for audio production, to Leslie Nielsen for community outreach, and Elisa Herendine for research. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. To hear more State of Mind conversations about mental health and wellness, join us on KSQD or ksqd.org on the first Sunday and the second Monday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. Or listen to any episode or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can also listen through your home smart speaker by saying play State of Mind podcast with Deborah Sloss. Thanks for joining us. This is listener-supported community radio KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.